Hello, welcome to the 17th episode of Cycles Podcast. Today we have a good friend, Nick Stinemates. Nick is currently the VP of Business Development and co-chair at Kentik. He has a lifelong passion for technology, both as a user and a developer, and has been primarily focusing on automation and finding unique ways to integrate products and businesses. Nick, it's great to have you on the show today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. First, before we even dive into Kentik, let's talk about who you are. Your history. For those who you might not be familiar with who you are, I know you worked at Docker. I know you worked at Rancher. Let's just dive into some of that.
So yeah, I started my journey with technology very young. Was like part of the generation that had a computer in their room from the earliest ages. But this was in the era of America Online, or AOL. And at that time, we didn't know it, but the little hacker community that we were part of, was participating in, open source at the truest sense, sharing code, trying to figure out how to write proggies, as we called them then, little add-ons for AOL. And I did that from, the age of 9 to probably the age of 13 or so. Official career-wise, I started in QA with a focus on automation. And quickly from there, I was responsible for, the entire pipeline of development from, ideation and product management all the way out to delivery at one of the first mobile companies out there. And it's through that I found, Docker and kind of the rest. So that was, that was a good foundation to get me prepared for, the fun times for sure.
And so with Docker, you were one of the earlier employees, right?
Yeah, employee number 6 or so, back when the company was called .cloud.
Got it. And .cloud was so for those who might not be familiar with the .cloud history before .cloud became Docker, because I know that there's a bit of a pivot in strategy, like from what I know about Docker, Docker was almost kind of an internal tool that they were using to solve some problems, and then that ended up becoming the main product. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's kind of like that. So .cloud was born in an era where, there was Heroku. It still exists today, but Heroku was kind of in its prime. And the limiting factor of Heroku was that, it was like for Ruby applications only. And .cloud was born as a multi-polyglot, platform where you could run anything. And yeah, containers were a fundamental way that we delivered the service. And Docker was born out of all of the learnings that, that were generated as a result of operating the .cloud platform as a service.
And so as you were going through the .cloud days, before it became Docker, what was kind of the turning point when you all realized, like, hey, what we're building with .cloud, this container technology is actually vastly more valuable? Yeah.
So .cloud long preceded me. That decision, was, let's say, made maybe a month or so before my official arrival. Docker was first talked about at a lightning talk at a PyCon in March of 2013. And I had read someone's blog post, a guy named Nicola Paolucci from Atlassian, probably in the April or May timeframe, that was talking about how containers were going to revolutionize, the industry, basically. And I was like, oh, what's this? And so I kind of dived in from that point and joined the company in June of that year. And I think we, officially became Docker, the company, in December of that year or something like that. And so, yeah, it was right at that transition period that, I and Ben Golub, who was the CEO of Docker for the first 4 years or so, we joined and kind of, helped the company make that transition.
And I guess while we're on that topic, I don't think we went over it yet. But what was your position within Docker or slash dot cloud slash Docker?
Yeah, it was fun because originally I didn't, I was an employee, but my job title was like deployment engineer or something like that. Like it was nondescript without really an understanding of what was going to happen. But on my first day, I went and met with a company called Nitrous.io who was doing IDEs in the cloud, and they were thinking about container technology to power that, and a few others. And so it seemed natural that I would continue on with the partnership conversations, and ultimately I ended up running basically the ecosystem of partners, of contributors, of integrators, and the strategic partnerships for the company.
Got it. And so, as you had your time at Docker. How long were you actually at Docker?
Just under 4 years.
Got it. And so post Docker, is that when you ended up joining Rancher, or what's the timeline look like?
Yeah. So, when pre-launch, the Rancher team came and to the Docker offices, and we were talking, about their plans for the company, and it was kind of like love at first sight for me with them. Like I was really fascinated by what they were trying to solve, and tried to acquire their company while I was at Docker multiple times. Didn't work out for various reasons, and towards the end, I was sitting at the last DockerCon that I attended in Texas, and there was a new CEO coming in. And I was thinking to myself, here we are, almost 400 employees generating X amount of revenue a year. And, there's my pet favorite company, Rancher, over there that, has significantly less. And they're generating significant revenue. Like, per employee, they were, crushing us, basically. And so I was wondering, like, it hit me, they must be doing something fundamentally different, because here you are at Docker, we have all of the opportunity in the world. We have a product that's, good enough for people to buy, and, but, how is it what is it that they're doing so differently? And so I wanted to find that out for myself. So that's why I joined Rancher.
And at Rancher, was your position similar to Docker, where you were in charge of partnerships and things?
Yeah, exactly. And partnerships have been the thing that I've worked on for the past, I don't know, 10 years or so. And it's probably time to get to make a change. We'll see how that goes. 2023, new year. So yeah, fun times ahead, I think.
And what was that like, going from, as you just alluded to, with kind of the revenue per employee metric, and Rancher generating more revenue? What was that like in terms of your role going from Docker, where you had this massive community adoption, everyone knew Docker, to Rancher, where obviously Rancher was a well-known player in the space, and is still a well-known company in the space, even though it's since been acquired. But I mean, you were kind of in two companies that had very different approaches. What did that look like?
Yeah, and that was like by design. So what I love about Rancher, and I think what is very successful about Rancher, and why they had such an amazing exit, right? Was their focus on teams that had a problem that needed to solve that problem today. Not tomorrow, not 5 years from now, not a journey of, completely greenfield deployment, but like, I have a problem and I need to solve it today. And the other thing that they've done, and they're doing with their, current venture, same team, is, set up weekly trainings to, get people on the on-ramp to, what are containers, what is Kubernetes, how do you use it? And it's very, it's was clearly Rancher branded, but it was not about Rancher. Like 1 in 4 episodes were featuring some Rancher technology or like some, roadmap update or something like that. But really it was, about teaching people, about bringing them along, about, bringing them into the tent. And I think those two efforts really set them apart from everyone else. They were that, and I guess they weren't tied to a particular infrastructure provider. They didn't have a unique point of view. They just said, here's Kubernetes and this is the best way to run it. Not, here's a managed service that you have to run it our way, or, it won't work sort of thing. So from a technology side, I think that was a unique differentiator for them.
Mm-hmm. And so as a founder, and I know that we have a lot of founders that watch or listen to this podcast. As a founder, one of the things that I always kind of noodle on within Cycle as we grow the company is, if you had to put a percentage of, if you're maintaining a balance based off of your target customer that you're trying to go after, and if you were to say, hey, if we had, if 100% includes both sales efforts and marketing efforts, where are we putting our weight, right? For example, right now with Cycle, we're aiming towards about a 70% emphasis on sales with a 30% emphasis on marketing things. Given that we've had a number of technical guests on the show, and you're technical as well, but given that you're also involved in partnerships and kind of the business sense, I'm curious what your thoughts were. Again, I know that you're no longer with Docker, I know that you're no longer with Rancher, but at least back to the times when you were seeing them in the early days of their company. If you had to break that down for those companies of like, okay, we're X percentage focused on marketing versus Y, versus, sales, etc. I'm curious kind of where you would place those two things as, I think it's just kind of an interesting thought exercise for, again, the founders that are listening to this, that are going through their own problems and their own, like, where do I put my time? Just curious, what your thoughts would be on that.
Yeah. So what's unique about Docker and Rancher versus where I've been most recently at Kentik is that they're open source companies from the outset. Like their main product is open source, and open source by definition is product led. You have to have a great experience, and people have got to know about it. They've got to adopt it in order for you to have a business relationship with them, right? And so marketing, however you want to quantify what is your marketing effort, is clearly very important, right? Because if people don't know about it, people aren't adopting it, and you can't sell anything to them, if that makes sense. If it's a SaaS company that doesn't have a freemium model or something like that, I think there might be a different a set of circumstances there. And so, first it's like comes down to what kind of company do you have, and do you need to, what sort of product market fit do you have? I think the better the product market fit you have, the more emphasis that you put on sales and execution around that. And the less product market fit you have, the more emphasis you need to put on building that flywheel of innovation, right? Of getting people to kick the tires, to provide feedback, to, start to tell other people, et cetera, et cetera.
That makes sense. And, I guess along that same line, I wish I could I wish I remembered. I wish I could remember who the tweet was by. This was right around Christmas time, so a few weeks ago. But the tweet was something along the lines of, as we get closer to an economic recession, we might already be in one, but as we get closer to an economic recession, product-led growth or product-led marketing is just a stepping stone to enterprise sales. And I wish I could remember who this was. It was some VC that was tweeting this out. But their whole, and then in the details they went into it, and it was all this whole premise of like in a market where you can easily raise money And you can spend a lot of money on marketing and kind of just hoping you find enough volume that people fall through that path. But when fundraising gets a lot harder and you're forced to grow a company through revenue, product-led growth, if you don't have already a lot of awareness and credibility, can actually is really, for a lot of companies, will end up being a stepping stone to enterprise sales, because they need to be able to generate. They can't put bets on long-term things. They need to start generating deal flow today. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I just think of myself as a technology buyer, right? Like, when it comes to tools, I like to be able to touch and understand, ahead of buying. And so, the mantra of technology is adopted more these days, that rather than sold, is something that resonates with me personally. But that's clearly biased, based on how I like to buy software, how technical I like to be, how hands-on I want to be, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I think that also, it depends on the scale of the problem that you have. That certainly influences the answer to that question also. And so, if it like everything, it's hard to create a silver bullet answer to that from my perspective. It just really depends on the technology and the opportunity ahead of you.
Yep, that makes sense as well. So as we kind of wrap up our discussion about Docker and Rancher, or your time at Docker and Rancher, I'm interested in hearing about, like, what were the biggest challenges that you had to deal with during the early days of building those companies?
Yeah. So the first challenge that we had was, okay, so people are interested, right? It's clear that, we can. One of the things that we did was we had weekly meetups at the Docker office every Thursday night. And there was people there. I met Darren Shepard from Rancher there for the first time, very early days. He was talking about Stampede.io, which is an orchestrator for Docker, like, really, Anyway, it was clear that people were interested. It's clear that a hacker community was being built around it. People were building integrations. We, created a list of images that we would want to see on Docker Hub, one day, and the next day the community had already created them. Like, there was real traction. But the first challenge was, okay, how do we make this real enough so that companies would actually buy it? There's one thing of, having adoption. There's another of, well, if I run this on a Red Hat machine, is Red Hat going to support it, or is it going to treat it like a cancer? Right. And so, our partnership with Red Hat and landing Docker as a part of RHEL 7, created a lot of problems, but it also solved a lot of problems for the business. It allowed us to go out there, and instantly we got credibility because Docker is now shipping with RHEL 7. So any questions about supportability or anything like that in the enterprise, were covered from that perspective. But that's kind of one business challenge, but there were so many. Later it was really how to carve out a niche and actually build a business. And I think you saw various waves of that occur through a recapitalization of the company, and now Scott Johnson running the company is just phenomenal. I mean, what they've managed to do with Docker Desktop and all of that is really brought a resurgence of Docker, the technology, back into the fold. So really impressed.
And I mean, with everything that you said, I just keep trying to, or I just, as you're talking and I'm listening, I'm just correlating that to some of the or not, maybe not correlating, but just kind of reflecting on the own experiences that I've had along the way, in my case, building Cycle. And it was really interesting because I think that when we first started to build Cycle years and years ago, we were seeing how Docker was growing, and of course, I didn't have the network that I do today. I didn't know, people like yourself who, were involved in building these companies. But so kind of as an outsider, just watching them, it was really interesting because we started to try to follow a lot of the things that Docker and Rancher and such were doing in terms of how do we build adoption. But I think it was also one of the biggest mistakes we made because, as you know, and as anyone, or hopefully anyone listening to this podcast knows, like Cycle's not an open source platform, right? So we were taking these open source initiatives that Docker and Rancher, et cetera, were following and kind of, going all in on community style efforts, and then having a closed source, platform that was, let's say, partially centralized and partially not. And so it was it took us a couple of years to kind of get over that, to kind of take a step back and be like, well, why are we even doing these things? Like, it doesn't make sense. It's a different product. And like when we first started the company, we were selling to individual developers, and then as time kept going on, we realized, like, wait, like, we're not open source. We're not really like individual developers. Like, I mean, yes, we love developers, but Cycle is built to solve business problems. Why do we keep trying to build this kind of individual developer ecosystem like Docker and Rancher? And of course, I know that Docker and Rancher are selling to businesses nowadays too, but they did that through adoption, right? Through overall adoption, but they did that because it was open source, et cetera. It was software they could install anywhere. And so it was really interesting as Cycle is growing through the journey that you're talking about, but from a different perspective, and realizing that I guess what I'm really getting at is, as a founder, I think sometimes you get so kind of caught up in, like, oh wow, that company's having success doing it that way, I'm going to do it that way, without actually taking a step back and looking at the intricacies and being like, well, actually, we're a different product. Like, we might be solving some of the same issues, but we're a different product with a completely different audience. And I think it took me a number of years to become aware of that, but when I was finally able to, like, fully accept and become aware of it, that's when Cycle started achieving the growth that it is now. And so that's one of the things that was really kind of interesting, as again, as you're talking, I'm kind of correlating these things, and as an outsider, it's just interesting to hear someone who was helping it from the inside.
Yeah, I've heard you talk in various forums about kind of the new focus that Cycle is taking, and I think that bringing your own infrastructure is certainly a unique and great take, because it helps. I think one of the biggest problems with adopting Kubernetes, and maybe we'll talk about that separately, but you have a unique and keen insight that companies are trying to understand how or why Kubernetes is valuable to them, and along with that, do I have to rebuild everything and rehire and retrain everyone? And so, being able to bring what you have and to be able to take advantage of Cycle, I think is, something that you uniquely have going for you, that I think is going to, set Cycle apart and, help the company succeed for sure. And it's a completely different motion than, replace everything. There's a new way of doing things. We need to train everyone to be able to do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I appreciate that, but two, I mean, I think that, and as I know you've held a lot of positions in business / partnership roles, but I also know that actually, you and I met because I think you saw a tweet or something about Cycle, and then we just started talking. You went through our old sign-up process, and you messaged me, you're like, this sucks. Like I don't like the sign-up process. And I was like, well, let's chat. Let's figure out why it sucks.
Yeah.
And so we went through that. So I guess my point was there that, even though you've been in business and partnership roles, you're also still developer, technical, you have that mentality. And, kind of bridging what you were talking about with Cycle and our approach and everything. I think at the end of the day, I think one of the big things that you and I both have in common is we want to be able to get stuff online quickly. And we don't want to have to be experts in all these different things to be able to do that. And that was the pure foundational premise of Cycle, right? You shouldn't need to be a DevOps a senior DevOps engineer to be able to get something online, right? Even if whatever that thing that you're getting online is of substance, right? Like it seems like right now on one side you have like, oh yeah, you want to get a simple blog online, you want to get a simple WordPress online, you want to host a simple, I don't know, MySQL database. Sure, there's a whole bunch of tools to do that. On the other side, you want to host a platform, and when I say platform, I'm talking about anything where there's an API to consume it. So you could be talking from something like Zillow to Coinbase to any of these big things, and but if you're going that path, well, the default has been like, okay, adopt Kubernetes, but there's and this is something that I know you and I both agree on from previous discussions outside of this podcast, but there's that whole middle where it's like, hey, there are companies out there that are building meaningful things that need more power than the easy spectrum of that, but don't have the problems of the upper side of that spectrum that require the ongoing maintenance and things like that of some of these big tools. And I'm not saying that Kubernetes doesn't fit some companies, because it absolutely does. Like there's some companies that absolutely need it, right?
But I think that along those lines, I think less companies need Kubernetes than they think that they do.
Yes.
There's more companies that think that they need it where they actually don't. And this is kind of like the thing that is said, but usually taken in jest, it seems, by the Kubernetes community a lot, really, which is like, Kubernetes is an implementation detail of the platform you decide to run on. It's not, the be all end all in and of itself, right? And so whether you take an opinionated point of view of that platform or you take it raw, you still have to build it. And so you still have to build expertise around it, and you still have to adapt it to your organization. And so, if you less think of it as a solution to your problems, but as a tool in sort of solving your problems, and I think companies will start to understand that that's not a skill set, that's not a core skill set that they want to build. They want the output of that, of the value of containerization, of the value of platforms, and being able to build those on top of others. So.
Yeah, well, and again, along that exact same idea, we were recently, our team went to the Gartner, I forget the initials. It was IO or IT something or other in Vegas back in December, and it was really interesting because for the longest time with Cycle, we had this approach of we were mainly selling to startups and small businesses, and we were like, oh, these big companies, they've already adopted Kubernetes, like they're probably, even though they might have had to fight to get there, they're happy with it. And but it was really interesting. Again, to the point that I think we're both, really kind of diving into here, is these companies, they wanted that result, but even after years of deploying and managing Kubernetes, they still haven't been able to achieve that desired result, right? And I was talking to one company, I'll leave out company name, but I was talking to their director of IT strategy, and he says, hey, what's Cycle? And I gave him the general gist, but the thing that really resonated with him was when I said, hey, Kubernetes might solve problems, 1 to 1,000. And my belief is that most companies only have problems 1 to 100. But by adopting Kubernetes, now they have to support problems 101 to 1,000, even if that's not part of what they actually need it for. Like they have to support the entire Kubernetes approach, even if they're only using, let's say, 10% of it. And it was really interesting to have these people, and I didn't expect this, to have these people kind of take a step back and be like, you're right, like it's complete overkill for us. And so with all of this conversation, where's with the context and experience you have in the industry, where do you see future container orchestration platforms, whether it's Kubernetes or an alternative like Cycle or something like that? Where do you see those kind of going?
Yeah, I think, well, one is it's going to be focused on solving the needs of the business as opposed to, core technology. I think this, happens time and time again when you start to innovate, and, it's a focus on new technology and how does it get applied. And then, as adoption increases, it's really about how do we purpose build? How do we adopt this core technology to work for, mainstream businesses? And I think that's, it going mainstream, less implementation details, being surfaced, and more business value is going to be the key differentiation in, any of these products, platforms that are coming out, including Cycle. And I think, again, the focus on understanding that people don't want to reinvent the world, people don't want to go on this building a platform, a fundamental platform, but instead use someone else's platform to build their business logic on, I think is a a unique take that should pay dividends.
And along that same line, what are your thoughts on infrastructure as code? Is that something that you've worked with much?
I mean, what a journey infrastructure as code the phrase has gone on, right? And now we're seeing it permeate beyond just creating server infrastructure or platform infrastructure. Now it's getting into how does infrastructure as code impact things like network gear? That dovetails a little bit into what we're working on over at Kentik, kind of. How does the rest of the data center modernize? And I think it's kind of the meaning continues to evolve, and it gets more and more broad as time goes on.
Well, you brought it up. Let's dive in. So, what you're doing today with Kentik? What's the company do? What problems are you trying to solve? And I guess we'll ask the same question I asked with Docker and Rancher. What is your position in the company?
Yeah, so I run partnerships and what's called labs at Kentik today. The company is 8 years old. Runs pretty lean. It's about 200 people. And I started there the week before the world shut down for COVID. And so it's like, March something. And so anyway, what the company does is it helps you answer any question that you have about your network. And so the typical buyer of Kentik is someone who is a large transit provider, a large ISP, or a large services company, like a big gaming company or a big service provider. Like anyway, anyone that relies on the internet for their business to function. And what it allows you to do is understand how your network is functioning in the context of the broader internet. Be able to answer questions about your network, like, is my traffic going over high cost transit links versus, cheaper, does capacity planning, etc. It was really built as a data dreamer's paradise. And more recently, we've been focused on, how all of those points of view intersect with cloud. How do they intersect with applications? And one of the things that Docker and by extension Kubernetes and the rest really brought about is the fact that there's these cloud services. You can easily package your application to run on any host. That host can be here, it can be there, it can be across the world. It doesn't really matter. But the thing that ties it all together is the network. And so understanding how that network is functioning, the performance of that network, etc., is a fundamental observability primitive that's needed, and it's not really pervasively available across all of the observability vendors. And so that point of view is what I've been working on at Kentik for the last couple of years.
And so with seeking a little, I don't want to say clarification, but just making sure that that we're on the same page, is so with Kentik, it is almost exclusively about the observability. And there's is there, I guess maybe the question that I just probably should ask is any part of Kentik actually the construction of those networks, or is it purely just visibility?
Yeah. Well, yes and no, right? Like,
okay.
what the what the software allows you to do is understand what's going on and get performance and things like that through synthetics tests, etc. But how that feeds into the creation of networks, etc., is the next step, right? So if you can see that this particular port on this particular switch has link congestion, because it's growing in this data center, etc., then you can kick off work orders to go and provision another switch, or to decide how you're going to increase capacity for that region. And so integrating with ticket systems and, making it part of that insight, part of a workflow for, new build outs or for optimization or, for troubleshooting is a big part of the core value of the technology.
And speaking of the technology, is your solution 100% software?
Yeah, it's 100% software. In traditional routers and switches, you can emit telemetry from them, typically in the form of what's called a flow. On Cisco devices, there's NetFlow. On other devices, there's SFlow. On some devices, there's IPFix. And so, what Kentik does at its core is takes that telemetry in, enriches it with some secret sauce of it's not just an IP address, but it's an IP address in this region that belongs to this network, that belongs to this CDN, etc. So it really expands the details of that flow record into quite wide, rich set of data, and then stores it in a fast way. And so it's like any other traditional observability system out there, but it's purpose built for network telemetry today.
And is it agnostic to, like, I know we've talked about Kubernetes a number of times today, but is it agnostic to the underlying orchestration software that someone is running?
Absolutely. So what's cool is you kind of have to make it aware if you want to get unique insights. And so one of the things that we did very recently at KubeCon is we launched an eBPF agent that is Kubernetes aware. And so it's an agent that sits on the host. And as traffic is passing through the Linux kernel, it looks at it and says, oh, I see this IP address 172 dot whatever, and asks Kubernetes like, hey, is this part of a Kubernetes workload? Is this part of a pod that's out there running? And if so, then it annotates that IP address with the pod name. Or in the cloud, it would annotate it with your VPC region or your VPC ID, etc. And so it starts to tag all of this network data that is flowing through either your router, switch, or in this case, a host, with as much context as possible. So then you can start to draw, maps of, here's my entire infrastructure deployment. Here's all of the applications that are running that are talking to each other, and you can start to get an understanding of performance of that, of latency between that, etc.
Interesting. That makes a lot of sense. And so, sorry, now my gears are spinning in terms of integrating with Cycle, because one of the things that we added to the platform, and sorry, I don't mean to take away from Kentik, but one of the things that we added to Cycle recently was a driver structure where we can have vendors that upload drivers, and then when someone's server starts and it boots up using Cycle OS, you can actually flag it and say, hey, this the server needs this driver, and a driver is just another container, right? But it runs at the host. So that Perfect. Way we could have that's how we added support for like GPUs and things like that. Like, because like we precompile all the GPU kernel modules, and then we inject them via container at boot time. So it's interesting because that would allow something like that to work as well.
It definitely would. Yeah. It and if you wanted to, understand, I've adopted this third-party service that is providing a database or something, and I'm noticing that at every 2 a.m., when users come into my site at 2 a.m., they're getting worse performance for whatever reason. You can answer the question, is it me? Is it my technology? Is it something about our network, or is it them, right? Like, the network was really going to be able to answer that question for you, by by being able to set baselines and looking at the metrics overall, et cetera. And so having that point of view, I think, would be really valuable.
We actually might need to have a deeper conversation after this podcast, because as
Absolutely.
we're getting in front of, like, as we're getting in front of bigger companies, I think, like, again, I don't want to say up until about the last 6 months, we were almost focused exclusively on startups. We've had a lot of success with much larger companies after within the last 6 months, and that's where, like, again, I mean, I'm guessing Kentik isn't focused on selling to 15, 20 person startups. It's focused on selling to companies that are moving lots and lots of data. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, typically companies that run their own network, and so yeah.
And that's where, recently, as we started having much larger companies come to us that are saying, "Hey, I have X number of terabytes of data that moving, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." Suddenly, these are problems that now it's like, ooh, how can we give better visibility to these companies? That these were questions that our earlier customers weren't asking. It wasn't meaningful to them, but now it's becoming actually pretty important. So it's interesting to learn more about what you're working on, and in terms of Kentik, with the solution that you've built, is there a certain type of niche customer that you found that really resonates with? I mean, I know like the observability tool can be beneficial to a lot of people, but is there a niche that you just had a lot of interest from a specific industry?
Yeah. What's cool is, like, that's our typical buyer is definitely changing, which is really interesting and bodes well for the company. So traditionally, it was like, again, ISPs and backbone providers, the people that make the internet go, right? That need to be able to understand. They sell traffic to big data centers, and that's now changed to more traditional enterprise. And their question is, I have this large network, I'm adopting cloud, probably hybrid cloud in some way, like I have some on-prem stuff and I have some cloud stuff. And it's exactly that question. Well, have I configured everything properly? Are my direct connects between us and the cloud working correctly? Is the customer experience as a result of all of this suffering, et cetera? And so, yeah, the traditional, Fortune 500 enterprise is more and more, starting to adopt these types of services. Beyond just general observability, it's really, is my business functioning holistically that Kentik can help them answer.
So the transition to Fortune 5, or not, I don't want, maybe I don't want to say transition, but with more Fortune 500 companies adopting it, are the questions that those companies asking different? Like if you had, so you said before it was like ISPs, companies that were providing backbones, etc. But as you're getting into Fortune 500, I mean, I know you just talked about, is my business running holistically, but is there more of like an emphasis on trying to figure out, like, I guess this is just a generalized question of if maybe these backbones are talking about throughput and bandwidth and things like that, and maybe general performance, are these businesses more caring about, like, I guess, is there a security component to Kentik in terms of like network security, and is that something that these Fortune 500 companies are really starting to look more into?
Yeah, definitely. And what's interesting is Kentik today is not a security product, right? People don't use it for that. But when we were at KubeCon talking about this new Kubernetes offering, the thing that resonated most was, there was one now customer who said, hey, we didn't know that all of this telemetry collecting stuff from these other observability players was running on our production cluster. Like, somehow, there's this traffic that we didn't know about at all. And so, with that, there was a clear security use case and policy use case that, they had misconfigured in their deployment somehow. And the other was, traffic going to embargoed countries. It's like, well, these embargoed countries aren't supposed to be able to be accessing in our our infrastructure is not supposed to be, talking to, but it is. And so there was a, compliance issue. And so, yeah, those are clear use cases that are resonating and triggering customers to buy, for sure.
Excellent. So as we begin to wrap up the podcast, one, really want to thank you for taking the time to be on the podcast. Two, it's been really interesting to learn all the different experiences that you've had, with a lot of the companies that people who are going to be listening and watching this podcast, hearing kind of, I don't want to say, the inside scoop, but hearing, from the inside how some of these things were being built out and thought about in the early days. But yeah, as we wrap up, is there any other thing that is on your mind that that you'd love to dive into?
No, I mean, I think 2023 is going to be a really interesting year. We kind of touched on it a little bit in terms of, where the market's heading, maybe a little tightening of the belt buckles a little bit, and the need for, getting stuff done today without a heavy lift, a heavy cost and lift. And so, I'm excited for what you all are working on, and I appreciate you having me on.
Excellent. Thanks, Nick. For everyone who is listening or watching this podcast, you can watch it on YouTube. Or if you prefer listening to podcasts, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and finally, all of the different podcasts are also listed on cycle.io/podcasts. Nick, for anyone who's listening or watching this, if they want to learn more about you, what you're building, what companies you're involved in, etc., where can they find you on the internet?
Yeah, just at Nick Stinemates on Twitter. We'll take you to everywhere else. So yeah, go there.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Nick. It was great to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.